Now Abram and Sarai had lived many years in the land of Canaan. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am the Almighty God. I will make my covenant between me and you will become the father of many nations. You will no longer be called Abram. Your name will now be called Abraham, and your wife Sarai will now be called Sarah. As God was speaking to Abraham, he fell face down onto the ground. God told Abraham, You will have many descendants after you. Your family will increase in number, and kings will come from your family line. This covenant between us will last forever. This is my promise to you. Abraham never forgot what God had promised him many years before. At that time, the Lord came to Abram in a vision and said, Fear not, Abram, I am your shield and great reward. Then God brought Abram out of his tent and pointed at the night sky filled with stars and said, Now look to the heavens and count the stars. If you are able to count them, so your children will be. Abram had faith and believed that God would one day fulfill that promise. Then God told Abraham, As for your wife Sarah, I will bless her, and I will give you a son by her. When Abraham heard this, he was so surprised that he laughed and asked God, Will a man who is 100 years old and a woman who is 90 have a child? But God answered Abraham, Your wife Sarah will have a son, and you will call him Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him, and all his family, and my covenant will never end. I will return to you about this time next year, and by then your wife Sarah will have a son. Abraham's wife Sarah just happened to be listening behind the door of the tent, and she began laughing at the thought of having a baby in her old age and said, Will I really have a child when Abraham and I are so old? Then God said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh? Is there anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you next year, and you will have a son. This scared Sarah very much, so she replied, I did not laugh. But God answered and said, Yes, Sarah, you did laugh. The following year, just as God had promised to Abraham and Sarah, they had a son, and they named him Isaac. By the faith of Abraham and Sarah, they received from God the gift of a son, Isaac. And even though they were very old, from their son Isaac came many descendants, as many as the stars in heaven and grains of sand by the seashore. Abraham, Sarah, and their son Isaac became very wealthy through the blessings of God as they continued to live in the land of Canaan and do all that God had commanded them to do. Sadly, at the age of 127, Sarah passed away. Abraham buried Sarah in a cave on the land that he purchased from a man that lived in Canaan. Now Isaac had grown into a man and had never married. So his father Abraham called the chief servant in his household and said, Please promise me that you will go to the country I came from and find a wife for my son Isaac. Abraham insisted that Isaac marry a woman from the country he was born in, so that the word God spoke to Abraham many years before would be fulfilled. To your offspring I will give this land. Then the chief servant took 10 of Abraham's camels and many valuable gifts with him, and set out for the land of Mesopotamia, where Abraham's relatives lived. When the chief servant arrived in the region where Abraham's family lived, he stopped by a well to water his animals. He quickly began to pray for a way to recognize the girl that God had chosen for Isaac. He asked God, "O Lord, please give me success today and show kindness to my master Abraham. When a girl comes to the well to fill her pitcher of water, and I ask for a drink, and she says, 'Drink, and I will water your camels,' let her be the one you have chosen for Abraham's son, Isaac. By this I will know she is the one." Soon after, a beautiful young woman came to the well to fill her pitcher with fresh water. The chief servant hurried to meet her and asked, "Please, would you give me a little water from your jar?" She replied, "Drink from this jar, and I will water your camels as well." While she was busy watering the camels, the chief servant watched closely to see if she was the girl that God had chosen for Isaac. He then asked her, "What is your name, and whose daughter are you?" She replied, "My name is Rebekah, and I am the daughter of Bethuel, who is the son of Nahor." Then the chief servant bowed down and worshipped the Lord God of Abraham, saying, "I praise you, God, that you led me straight to Abraham's relatives. Now I pray that this beautiful woman of God will agree to return with me to become the wife of Isaac." Rebekah ran home and told her mother what had happened at the well. Her brother Laban went to the well and invited the chief servant to their home to give him and his animals rest and food. The chief servant shared the story with Rebekah's family and asked if she would return with him and marry Isaac. The family agreed that God had directed this plan, and it was up to Rebekah to make the decision. She decided to leave her family and become the wife of Isaac in the land of Canaan. The servant then brought out gold, jewelry, and costly gifts from Abraham and gave them to the family of Rebekah. Early the next morning, after receiving blessings from her family, Rebekah, her nurse, and the chief servant set out for the long journey home. After traveling a long time, Rebekah looked up and saw a man standing in the field coming to meet them. She got down from her camel and asked, "Who is that?" The chief servant replied, "It is Isaac, the man you are to marry." Isaac and Rebekah were soon married, and he loved her very much. A famine swept through the land that God had given to the Israelites. A man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi, along with their 2 sons, decided to leave the town of Bethlehem in the country of Judah and go to the land of Moab in search of food. The family settled in Moab, and eventually the 2 sons married women from the tribe of Moab. Sadly, Elimelech died, and soon after, the 2 sons also died. Naomi was left all alone except for her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. One day, Naomi heard the people of Moab saying the Lord had answered the prayers of the Israelites. The famine was over, and once again, the Israelites began growing their own food in Bethlehem and the surrounding country where Naomi and her family had once lived. With a sad heart, because of the loss of her husband and 2 sons, Naomi decided to return to Bethlehem and to the country where all her relatives lived in the land of Judah. Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law packed up everything they owned and set off on the road back to Bethlehem. They had not gone far when Naomi turned to them and said, "You have shown such love and kindness to me at the death of my husband and 2 sons. It will be best if you return to your mother's home, and may God bless you with husbands from the land of Moab." Then Naomi kissed each one, and they both began to cry and said, "Please, let us go back with you to your people in the land of Judah." But Naomi said, "Return to Moab and your relatives, my daughters. I will never have more sons for you to marry. It's better that you go back to your people and find a husband to marry." When Naomi said this, both Orpah and Ruth began to cry again at the thought of leaving Naomi all alone. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to Naomi and said, "Please, do not ask me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and may God deal with me harshly, if anything but death separates us." When Naomi realized how determined Ruth was to stay with her, they traveled on to the land of Bethlehem. Naomi and Ruth had no male protector or source of income since Naomi's husband and 2 sons had passed away. But God made provisions in His law to take care of both the poor and the widows. They were allowed to glean the leftover wheat or grain in the landowner's fields so they could take care of their families. Very soon, Ruth came to Naomi and said, "Please, let me go out to the fields to pick up some leftover grain from the harvest. This will give us food to eat." So Ruth took a basket and went to the fields to glean the leftover harvest. Naomi had a relative of her deceased husband named Boaz. He was very wealthy and had many fields that were ready for harvest. Ruth happened to come to Boaz's field to glean. She had worked most of the day in the hot sun when Boaz saw her and asked his foreman in the fields who she was. When he found out that she was the daughter-in-law of his relative, Naomi, he approached her and said, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Please stay in my fields among my servant girls and pick up all the grain you need. Whenever you are thirsty, you may get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." With great relief, she replied, "Why are you so kind to someone from a foreign land?" Boaz kindly replied, "I've been told about all you have done for Naomi after the death of her husband and 2 sons, how you left your homeland and family and followed Naomi to the land of Judah to love and serve the God of Israel. May the Lord richly reward you for what you have done." During mealtime that day, Boaz invited her to sit with him and share his food. Afterwards, he gave orders to his men to pull stalks of grain from among the bundles for her to easily pick up that day. Ruth returned home that evening, and Naomi saw that she had gathered a large amount of grain. She asked Ruth, "Where did you work today? Blessed is the man who shared such a large amount of grain." When Ruth told her that it was Boaz, she replied, "The Lord bless him. He is a close relative and one of our kinsman redeemers." The kinsman redeemer was a male relative who had the responsibility to help a family member who was in trouble or need, and usually involved redeeming their relative's property or freedom. For the rest of the harvest season, Ruth did as Boaz told her and stayed in his fields with his female servants and picked up the leftover grain for her and Naomi to live on. When the harvest was over, Naomi came to Ruth and said, "My daughter-in-law, since you have found such favor with Boaz, wash and put on your best dress, and go down to visit him while he is threshing his wheat on the floor of his barn. Wait until he is finished for the evening, and after he eats and drinks, he will lie down for the night. Lift the corner of his blanket and uncover his feet while he is sleeping. Then lie down at his feet and respect." During the night, Boaz woke up and was startled to find a woman lying at his feet. He asked, "Who are you?" Ruth replied, "I am your servant Ruth.
and I am here to ask you to take me as your wife, since you are a kinsman redeemer to Naomi." Boaz replied, "May the Lord bless you. All the people of our town know that you are a woman of excellent character. You could have married many young men from among the city, but you've chosen me, a close relative and kinsman redeemer to Naomi. But there is a kinsman redeemer who is a closer relative to Naomi than myself. If he wants the responsibility of the kinsman redeemer and to take you as his wife, then I must let him." The next day, Boaz went to the town gate and sat down to wait for the kinsman redeemer. When Boaz saw him, he said, "Come over here, friend, and sit down." After Boaz explained the situation to him, he decided not to accept the responsibility as kinsman redeemer to redeem Naomi's property and take Ruth as his wife. Boaz went back to Ruth with the good news, and they were soon married. Ruth eventually conceived and had a son that they named Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David, a future king. There was a certain man named Elkanah, an Ephraimite, that had 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had many children, but Hannah had none. This grieved and saddened Hannah's heart so terribly that each year, when they all traveled to the house of the Lord to worship and give thanks to God, she would cry and refused to eat. Peninnah saw her grief and would make it even worse by taunting and teasing her because she had no children. One year, as they traveled to the house of the Lord to worship God, Hannah once again stood and wept before the Lord in deep grief and pain. Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the house of the Lord. Because of her great distress, she cried out to the Lord, "O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life." As she kept praying to the Lord, Eli the priest watched her mouth. Hannah was praying fervently in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought that she was drunk and said to her, "How long will you keep getting drunk? Get rid of your wine." Hannah answered, "Oh, my Lord, I am not drunk from wine. I am a woman who is deeply troubled and am pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not think I am a worthless woman, for I have been praying to God out of my great anguish and grief." Then Eli blessed her and said, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel give you what you have asked of him." Hannah replied, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Afterwards, Hannah felt great hope within her and went on her way, no longer feeling sad or downcast. The next morning, the entire family traveled back to their home. The Lord remembered Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." Hannah's heart was full of joy for her son Samuel, but she never forgot her promise to God that if she had a son, she would give him back to the Lord to serve him all the days of his life. When the time came for the family to make their yearly journey to the house of the Lord to worship God, Hannah told her husband Elkanah, "Samuel is still too young, but when I wean him, then I will make the journey and give him back to the Lord to serve God all his life, just as I promised." When Samuel was weaned from his mother, Hannah made the journey to the house of the Lord to give him to the service of God. When Hannah and Elkanah brought Samuel to Eli the priest, she said, "Oh, my Lord, as surely as you live, I am the woman who stood before you desperately praying for a child. The Lord granted my request, so I have given him to the Lord to serve him all the days of his life." Elkanah and Hannah then traveled back to their home. Each year, as they would return to the house of the Lord to worship God for all his blessings, Hannah would visit Samuel and bring him a new robe to wear. Eli the priest would bless Elkanah and Hannah, saying, "May the Lord give you children to take the place of the one that Hannah prayed for and gave back to the Lord." God was gracious and enabled Hannah to conceive. She gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. This filled Hannah's heart with joy and faith in the God of Israel. Meanwhile, Samuel continued to grow and serve in the house of the Lord and found favor with the Lord and with men. Samuel.
The book of Esther is an unusual story in the Bible. It never mentions God or prayer. It might appear to be a story about a good Jewish girl whom God uses to save his people, the Jews, from destruction. But God didn't use Esther because she was good or righteous. In fact, we see in this story that Esther did not keep the Jewish Mosaic law. She compromised her values. She broke Jewish dietary laws. And she married a pagan king, which was certainly forbidden by God. And yet, God used her to save his people and accomplish his will on this earth. The book of Esther is a story to show us that, despite our sin, God can use us for his purpose and glory. The Jews had been held in captivity for many years by the Babylonians, but eventually the Medes and the Persians took over the captivity of the Jews. During the time of the Persians, a king named Ahasuerus sat on the royal throne. King Ahasuerus was so proud of the riches and great wealth in his kingdom that he put them on display for 180 days for all to see. When these days were completed, he held a lavish banquet for all the important people in his kingdom. There were beautiful white and purple linen curtains and couches made of gold and silver, covered in the most expensive cloth. The king served the best wines and food to everyone. The king's wife, Queen Vashti, also gave a banquet for all the women in the palace. On the last day of the banquets, a very happy King Ahasuerus called for Queen Vashti to come before the royal court to be seen by all because her beauty was so great. But Queen Vashti refused to come. This made the king so angry that he consulted the wise men of his kingdom as to what he should do. The wise men discussed the matter and suggested the king create a new law that stated that if the queen refused the king's orders, then the queen could no longer come into the presence of the king, and her royal position would be given to a woman more worthy than her. That's exactly what King Ahasuerus decided to do. Queen Vashti would no longer be queen, and a new queen would be selected. All of the single, young, most beautiful women in the kingdom were brought to Hegai, the king's official, who was in charge of taking care of the young women. Esther was one of the many young women chosen to appear before the king, and she was very beautiful in every way. As a very young girl, her mother and father had died, so her uncle, named Mordecai, took her in and became like a father to her. Esther and Mordecai were Jews that lived and prospered among the people of Persia. As Esther grew into a young woman, her great beauty brought her to this point in time. She would now go before the king of Persia to see if he would pick her to become his queen. Before she left for the palace, Mordecai, her uncle, instructed her to never reveal that she was a Jew. All of the young girls that had been selected, including Esther, took many months to work on their appearance and beauty. They were given the best cosmetics and lotions and fed the best foods. During these many months, Mordecai would pace back and forth in front of the palace each day, checking to see how Esther was doing. Finally, it was Esther's turn to go before King Ahasuerus. The king immediately saw her great beauty, and she quickly found favor with the king above all the other women. He placed the crown upon her head and proclaimed her as queen. Then the king gave a great banquet to honor Esther, his new queen. Meanwhile, Mordecai, who loved Esther as a daughter, became a watchman at the king's gate. This allowed him to stay close to Esther. One day, 2 guards at the gate became angry with the king and planned to kill him. When Mordecai heard of this evil plot to attack the king, he was able to pass the information on to Esther. Esther then told King Ahasuerus about it. And when an investigation in the matter showed that it was indeed true, both men were hanged on the gallows, and the incident was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. As time went on, King Ahasuerus appointed a man named Haman to one of the highest positions in the royal court. The king commanded all the men at the gate leading to the palace to bow down and pay homage to Haman each time he passed through the gate. All the men would bow as Haman passed through the gate, except Mordecai, who refused to bow. This filled Haman with rage, and when Haman learned that Mordecai was a Jew, he vowed to destroy all the Jews that lived in the kingdom. This would include the Jewish queen, Esther. Now Haman was a very sneaky and conniving man. He went before King Ahasuerus and said, "There is a certain people who live among the people of your kingdom. Their laws are different from the king's laws, and therefore they refuse to observe your laws. It's not good to allow them to live. If it pleases the king, let there be a decree to destroy these people, and then 10,000 talents of silver will be paid to the men who carry out the king's decree." The king quickly agreed to the deadly decree, never realizing that his own Queen Esther would be one of these people Haman wanted to destroy. Soon, a copy of the decree was sent out to all the kingdom. When the Jews heard the decree, they fell into great mourning, weeping and wailing. Mordecai put on mourning clothes called sackcloth, which looked and felt like a rough burlap bag, and cried bitterly for his people at the king's gate. When Esther's maidens told her about the decree, she collapsed in great agony. She sent new clothes to Mordecai, but he refused to take off the sackcloth. Since Mordecai could not enter the king's palace clothed in sackcloth, Esther sent a message to Mordecai, asking him what she should do. The messenger returned with Mordecai's reply. Mordecai begged Esther to go before the king and ask for his favor and plead with him for the lives of their people. When Esther heard this, her heart sunk. She sent the messenger back to Mordecai, saying, "Everyone in this kingdom knows that the king has a law that anyone who comes before the king without being summoned by him is to be put to death unless the king holds out the golden scepter to him." When Mordecai heard her reply, he sent back this response: "Do not think for 1 minute that you will escape death in the palace any more than the rest of the Jews. If you remain silent at this time, God will deliver us in some other way, but as for you and your father's house, you will surely die. And who knows, maybe you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go and gather all the Jews that live in the kingdom and fast for me. Do not eat anything for 3 days and nights. My maidens and I will do the same thing. After this time of fasting I will go before the king, even if it is against the law, and if I die, I die." Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had instructed. On the 3rd day, after all the Jews, including Esther and her maidens, had fasted, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne, and as soon as he saw Queen Esther, he was very pleased, and held the gold scepter that was in his hand out to her. Then the king asked, "What can I do for you, Queen Esther? I would give you up to half my kingdom if you requested." Esther replied, "If it would please you, my king, I would like to invite you and Haman to come and dine with me at a banquet I have prepared for you." "Bring Haman at once, so that we may do what Esther requests," answered the king. As they all dined at the banquet, the king asked Queen Esther, "What is your request? I would give you even up to half my kingdom." Then Esther said, "If I have found favor before the king, I would love to invite both the king and Haman to a second banquet tomorrow, and then I will make my request known." The king and Haman happily agreed. Haman left the palace very happy until he passed Mordecai at the gate. When Mordecai refused to bow, Haman was filled with rage again, but he restrained himself and went home. As soon as Haman got home, he called his wife and friends together and began to brag about all the ways the king had honored him and placed him above all the other nobles and officials in the kingdom. He went on to tell them how Queen Esther had invited him and the king to a banquet that very day, and that she invited them to another banquet the next day. But Haman said, "All this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." So his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Have a gallows built, and then tell the king about Mordecai, and surely the king will agree to hang him." This suggestion made Haman very happy, so he ordered the gallows to be built for the next day. That night, the king could not sleep, so he gave orders for the book of the Chronicles that records everything that happens in the king's reign be brought in and read to him. As it was read, the king heard how Mordecai exposed the 2 guards that had planned to assassinate him. The king then asked, "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" The king's servants told him that nothing had been done for him. And the king said, "Who was in the court?" It just so happened that Haman had entered the outer court of the palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai. So the king's servant said, "Haman is standing in the court." The king said, "Bring him in." As soon as Haman walked in, the king asked, "What should be done for the man that the king wants to give great honor and recognition?" Haman thought to himself, "Who would the king want to honor more than me?" So he told the king, "Bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, and allow one of the king's most noble princes to lead this honored man on horseback through the city square, all the while proclaiming, 'This is what will be done for the man the king desires to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robe and horse, and do these things, just as you have said, for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate." Haman did exactly as the king instructed, but as soon as he arrived back at the king's gate with Mordecai, Haman hurried home, mourning, with his head covered. He told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. When his wife and friends warned him, "If Mordecai is Jewish, then you will not overcome him. You will surely fall before him." While his friends were still talking to him, Haman was picked up by the king's officials and quickly brought to the banquet which Esther had prepared. King Ahasuerus, Haman, and Esther were all sitting at the banquet table when the king asked, "What is your request, Queen Esther?" "It will be granted to you, even up to half my kingdom." Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor with you, and it pleases the king, let my life and the lives of my people be spared. A decree has gone out from the kingdom to kill and annihilate all the Jews in the kingdom, and that would include me." The king quickly asked Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he? Who would ever think to do something like this?" Then Esther turned towards Haman and said, "It is this wicked man Haman, who is the enemy of me and my people." The king became so angry that he jumped up from his seat and went into the palace garden to think. Meanwhile, Haman threw himself upon Queen Esther's couch, begging for his life. When the king came back from the palace garden and saw Haman on Queen Esther's couch, he cried out, "Will he even try to assault my queen in my own house?" As soon as the words came out of the king's mouth, the king's officials covered Haman's face with a cloth. Then one of the officials said, "Haman made gallows at his house to hang Mordecai the Jew on, who revealed the assassination attempt on your life." Immediately the king replied, "Hang him on the gallows." That very day, they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai. King Ahasuerus then gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. When Esther revealed to the king who Mordecai was to her, the king called Mordecai before him. He took off the royal signet ring that Haman had worn and gave it to Mordecai. Then Esther put Mordecai over the house of Haman which the king had given her. Now the decree was still in effect, because once the king put his royal seal on a decree, it could never be taken back. So Queen Esther fell at the feet of the king and begged him to find a way to keep their people safe from the deadly decree to kill all the Jews. So King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "I will allow you to write another decree to be given to all your people in every city and province." So Mordecai wrote a new decree that granted the Jews the right to come together and defend themselves against any army of people that came against them. This new decree was sealed with the king's own signet ring and sent out among all the cities and provinces where the Jews lived. When God's people, the Jews, read the new decree, they celebrated with great joy and happiness, for their lives had been saved.